In The Children Act, Ian McEwan's new novel, the main character is a judge routinely confronted with difficult moral decisions. These are cases that are brought to her courtroom where she has to adjudicate between differing perspectives. The central case that she has to contend with is whether a 17-year-old should be able to refuse life-saving blood transfusions based upon his religious convictions. All the while that the judge is making these choices for plaintiffs in her court, her personal life is unraveling. She has to discover how to deal with her husband's infidelity. The book provides a detailed portrait of how human beings make complicated decisions and the ways that ethical choices can be tied up with our personal feelings, with legal difficulties, and with public argument. McEwan's book reflects the kind of decision-making process that many of us, I think, would expect when confronting moral choices. There is a contemplative weighing of pros and cons, thinking in terms of precedents and history, wondering what the ramifications of such a decision will mean for others. In many ways, it is quite philosophical, and the reflection reminds me quite a bit of the course that I teach at Las Positas. It is a joint class with the Livermore Valley Charter School, and I love the conversations that I have in that course. I teach ethics, and questions come up such as, should one consider the rights of a particular person or the welfare of society? What does one do with questions on abortion, stem cell research, sexuality, war, and the death penalty? How does one know how to do the right thing? All of this questioning is deliberative and philosophical and something that I find quite alluring. But I also realize that it is only sometimes the form that ethical decision-making takes. Often, the choices that we make are generated not by a lengthy weighing of pros and cons and principles, but rather by snap decisions, and those snap decisions have impacts and ramifications that extend to the rest of our lives and to the lives of others. In his book, Beautiful Souls, Saying No, Breaking Ranks, and the Voice of Conscience in Dark Times, author and journalist E.L. Press examines just this kind of decision-making, looking at profound acts of courage in the most difficult circumstances. I'd like to tell one of the stories in the book here. In November 1991, a convoy of buses snaked its way towards a small village in northern Serbia, carrying several hundred prisoners of war. The buses came from a neighboring Croatian town on the banks of the Danube River, where for several months a fierce battle raged between the Croats and the Serbs. In this bloody ethnic skirmish, the Croats had the superior motivation. They were fighting for independence, having voted to secede from Yugoslavia in May. But the Serbs had the superior arms, laying siege to the Croatian town from the neighboring hilltops with ordnance supplied by the Yugoslavian National Army, which was controlled by the leader of Serbia, Slobodan Milosevic. The Serbs struck churches, water towers, factories, monasteries, and beautiful old castles, and eventually the town fell into their hands, or what was left of it, anyway. Nearly 90 days of indiscriminate bombing turned an enchanting river port into a cratered moonscape of pulverized buildings and spent artillery shells. Rubble was piled thick and high on the roads. Plastic sheets were stretched over the bullet-riddled corpses of the unburied dead. Soon after this town fell to the Serbs, the men in the town were rounded up, packed into buses, and driven across the border to Serbia, to a string of hastily assembled and conveniently secluded detention facilities. Among the largest of these was an abandoned cowshed. After passing inside, before passing inside, some of the captives were ordered to pass through a gauntlet of Serbian soldiers who whacked them with clubs and trenches as they passed by. One Croat talked about watching a friend of his get beaten to death before his eyes. He then absorbed plenty of harsh beatings himself. Not much mercy was shown, though there was one restraining factor that did exert itself, at least for a while. Before it fell under siege, the town had been the home of an assortment of ethnic groups, including tens of thousands of Serbs. Many had fled the town that spring, but not all had managed to escape before the outbreak of hostilities made doing so too dangerous. This meant that mixed among the prisoners inside the cowshed were some people who they wished to spare from mistreatment, their fellow Serbs. The dilemma was resolved, or at least appeared to be, when one of the officers spotted a familiar face among the prisoners. He was a big, bear-like man. His name was Alexander Jeftic, and he was a Serb. Years earlier, Jeftic and the officer in charge had served together in the Yugoslav National Army. The two men exchanged warm greetings. The officer then entrusted Jeftic with a delicate and urgent task, the job of identifying the other Serbs so that they could be taken to a separate room. You see, the conflict between the Serbs and the Croats was complicated by the fact that they lacked obvious physical distinguishing characteristics. Their names were the most obvious identifying feature that would potentially separate them into one group or the other. "Pick carefully," said the officer in charge. Jeftic nodded and began wading through the knot of prisoners that was jammed inside the cowshed, who were ranged across a bare cement floor. Some of the men sat slumped and shivering from the cold. Others quietly nursed their wounds, hoping to avoid drawing attention to themselves, since every so often a guard pointed to someone who would then be taken outside for questioning and more abuse. Not until the representatives from the International Red Cross arrived several weeks later to catalog the prisoners' names would the atmosphere of terror lift. By then, many of the inmates had been tortured or killed. In the meantime, the task of separating out the privileged from the damned fell to Jeftic, who started pointing to various Serbs that he recognized. He then began kicking the feet of others, calling out their names and signaling them to rise. "Come with me, Kovacevic," he told one detainee, a trim, muscular man with pale blue eyes who had his head angled down and his hands in cuffs. The man peered up warily but didn't move because his name was not Kovacevic, it was Stanko, which meant that he was a Croat and not a Serb. "Come with me," Jeftic repeated. Hesitantly, the bewildered man rose to his feet as the Croatian prisoners around him exchanged puzzled glances, wondering what was going on. Jeftic called another Croat forward, and then another, and one more, addressing each of them by a traditional Serbian name, until the prisoners who caught on to what was happening began motioning for them to choose them, for Jeftic to choose them as well. Please bring me," they began to whisper. "Okay, come, hurry," Jeftic replied after peering over his shoulder to make sure that none of the guards had overheard. It went on this way for some time. Jeftic stopped only when no more bodies could be squeezed into the area designated for the Serbs. On behalf of people that he did not know particularly well and who fell on the other side of a raging ethnic battle, Jeftic risked his life. If discovered, he would likely have been executed or tortured as a traitor to his people. Jephthah saw a path diverge before him where he could either do what was expected of his identity group or he could choose a harder path. He chose the harder path. It strikes me that through all of the deliberations that one might make about ethics, all of the considerations and the back and forth and the pros and cons, it's not necessarily elaborate theories that matter, but rather it is the decisions like Jephthah's that matter the most. Indeed, one might even ask the question of whether theory is necessary in order to make ethical decisions, a question I'm not going to ask Las Positas because then I might be out of teaching that class. But it's a good question, and it is one that has been asked. In his essay, The Disparity Between Intellect and Character, Robert Coles writes about the wide chasm between one's grasp of ethical philosophy and one's daily practical actions. He writes of students who got A's in his ethics class and who nonetheless take advantage of others in their daily lives. He also lists some of the great thinkers and writers, including Martin Heidegger and Ezra Pound, who contributed vastly to the intellectual life of the West and yet sympathized with the Nazis. Clearly, one's intellectual abilities are not necessarily or automatically useful in making hard, practical, ethical decisions. But if they are not always helpful, then what is? What is it that leads people like Jephthah to risk everything to behave in a morally heroic way? I would like to submit today that what is far more effective than theory in helping us act ethically is our proximity to others. We need to hear the stories of others' lives and to come into contact with those lives. Narrative, if it's not used in a narrow ideological way, can expand our capacity for empathy. It can cultivate a curiosity about the lives of others and draw us closer to their perspectives. What may have started as irreconcilable differences becomes, through narrative and interaction, the very possibility for connection and for caring for another. If we make that curiosity and proximity to others a part of our habits, if we make it something of a discipline, we might begin to form the basis for doing the right thing. It might spark in us the kind of courage to act in difficult circumstances. There are many issues that would benefit from this discipline of proximity, of our drawing closer and paying attention to the lives of others. As one concrete example, I invite you to the forum that will take place at noon in the Tot Green Room, where we will discuss the lives of those in Ferguson, the tensions that have erupted there over the summer, and where we can go from here. E.L. Press, the author of Beautiful Souls, met with Alexander Jephthah many years after that fateful day in the cowshed. Sitting in Jephthah's tiny apartment, Press was surprised to discover not a single book on the shelves. Jephthah had not finished high school. At the time of the interview, he had an 11-year-old son, and both the son and his father shared a love for tennis. That shared passion was the only thing evident in the humble apartment. Press asked Jephthah why he did it, wanting to get to the bottom of how this unassuming and humble person could commit such a dangerous and dramatic act of moral heroism. Unraveling people's motivations is tricky business, of course, since there's usually no one motive that grounds any particular action. It's more the complex story of who we are that causes us to act in a particular way. Nonetheless, Jephthah gave one telling reason for why he rescued so many Croats in that cowshed on that distant, terrifying day. he says that he thought about his mother and what she had taught him and what she would have done then. In a particularly revealing moment in the book, Jeff Tick said that during World War II, his mother was held in a concentration camp that was infamous for its brutality. But she managed to survive, and when she got out, she did not swear revenge or nurture some sort of hatred. Instead, in spite of her experience, she became convinced that people should not treat one another in the way that she was treated. Indeed, her proximity to the suffering of others caused her to refuse the ethnic prejudices that so infected her country at that time. Instead of nurturing those prejudices, she taught her son to cultivate a basic respect for others and for himself. "I'm not defiant," Jeff Tick said in the interview. "My behavior has to do with the way that I was raised." I wonder how we can find the courage to act in the way that Jeff Tick did and to pass along that courage in the way that his mother did. How might we cultivate proximity and closeness instead of division? How might we cultivate proximity and closeness in place of our strange and foolish walls? My spiritual companions, may we ask those questions anew on this day. I love you. Blessings on your journey, and amen.